Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Archie Richards, and he's publishing a book coming up, a very timely, important book, considering the state of the United States. And the title of that book, which will be published in September of 2021, is America's Bankruptcy Approaches: How to Resolve the Issue and Prevent It from Reoccurring. Again, the author's name is Archie Richards. It's not his first book. Last year, he wrote America's Governments, Enemies of the Poor, published 2020. And then in 2007, he wrote Understanding Exchange-Traded Funds. So he's very apt and has skilled knowledge about financial markets and financial issues. And he can talk more about that. So, Mr. Archie Richards, are you there?
I certainly am, William. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for agreeing to the interview. For people who may not know of your background, can you talk a little bit about yourself, maybe your professional career, and what led you to write this book, America's Bankruptcy Approaches?
Well, I started out in the investment business. I was registered with the Security and Exchange Commission as an investment advisor, and but then I became a nationally syndicated columnist. I wanted to try to persuade people how to avoid brokers. And I found I loved writing, especially about money matters. It was called Richards on Money Matters. And I did that for quite a number of years. And then I'm also, there's a piano in my background. I'm also a concert pianist, and I went back to that and did that professionally for a number of years. And but then when the lockdown came, I was no longer able to go to play. So I had already written a number of monthly columns on current affairs, and I thought, well, why don't I had done that for 3 years, and to my friends and to the local newspaper, and I thought, why don't I just turn those into a book? And the result of that was my last book, America's Governments, Enemies of the Poor. And then I still had some material available, and wrote this one that I consider to be the best book I've ever run, and that is America's Bankruptcy Approaches. It really is terrifying, and I think it's very important to address the issue.
I agree. And so can you explain for people who may not know the current financial predicament of the United States what this situation is?
Well, there's a lot of people who are making predictions, not too many talking about the possibility of America's bankruptcy fairly soon. And I consider it very important because right now we are in the midst of inflation caused by a tremendous increase in the volume of money that the government has created beginning in March of 2020. Now, after that, it's been at the rate of about 23% a year. And it hasn't been at that rate since 1940s. So we are facing significant inflation.
Right. I think the stat was it's the most money that's been created over the history of the United States. Like, more money was created in the last 2 years than was ever created in the United States.
Yes, and it's all done most of it by the federal government, by the Federal Reserve, which creates the money out of nothing. And they thought, well, we'll just keep going, and we'll just keep interest rates low, and that'll be okay. Well, it isn't going to stay low, because inflation brings up, not only does it bring up prices, it also causes interest rates to rise. And when the interest rates rise, the cost of carrying the debt begins to crowd out current expenses.
Right.
And then at that point, especially if the government has to borrow in order to pay the interest, you're really in a pickle then.
Right. And we're already financing our own current debt, I think, at very low interest rates. But if those interest rates rise, the whole balance sheet of the government changes, right?
Exactly. And that is inevitable because because after the significant increase in the price of money supply, then comes rising commodity prices.
Right.
And after that,
we're already seeing that. Right?
We've already seen that, and now we're seeing an increase in the economy, and following that is a significant increase in the cost of money.
Right. And so you talk about the 10-year bond as a very important standard. How is that changing interest rate going to affect everything?
Well, it does not change. It is merely an indicator of what the general, because that's considered the bellwether of interest rates, and it's considered the most important of the interest rates. It's the lowest 10-year. It's the 10-year bond, and it has an enormous volume of activity, and it's just considered the best indicator of treasury interest rates. Now, right now, it's still low, but it is going to stay there.
I mean, we're really kind of at a precipice. So, can you talk about what the deficit spending is right now? Do you remember offhand what percentage we're paying to finance the deficit from our income?
I don't remember. I'm sorry. Okay. I don't have a very good memory.
I think it's like 70. I think you wrote 17% of the GDP is financing the deficit. So our GDP, I think, is like $6.5 trillion. So we're spending a significant amount of money to have this huge debt.
I think the GDP is
gross domestic. Maybe it's more.
I guess you're right. Yeah. So all those figures are in the book.
Right. So I mean, it's a very detailed book. What do you think? So we have this huge debt. We're spending like crazy. There could be even more spending. There's this proposed, they're calling it an infrastructure bill, right? That could be another $2 trillion. What's next?
Well, I don't think they should spend any money on infrastructure, because I think that the best way to deal with the issue of the debt is to offer the debt that is owed to the United States is to offer I'm getting tied up. Offer to corporations mostly the things that the federal government owns. It owns about almost $5 trillion of gold. We should sell that in return for a portion of the amount of the debt that's owed to the United States. And then the United States government owns 28% of the total amount of land in the United States. That's an enormous amount. And I think they should sell that to the corporations in return for taking over the debt. And that includes the rivers and the 12-mile portion of the ocean that surrounds our nation. And it includes the mountains and the prairies and the aquifers and the rivers and lakes. It should all be sold.
Sold to just corporations. But I mean, who holds our debt right now? It's mostly China, correct?
Oh, no, it's mostly the United States. A portion of our debt is owned by foreign nations, but not the majority. Most of it is owned by the United States people.
Gotcha. So the United States are individuals. And what, I mean, you'd write in your book, I think Argentina has defaulted on its debt like 9 times. They just default every 10 years. What would be the response if the U.S. just decides not to pay its debt?
It would be very serious, because the debt is owned by the people of the United States and the banks of the United States. Like when you put a deposit in the bank, a portion of that deposit goes into the purchase of United States bonds. Well, if those bonds aren't paid, bingo, the banks is way behind on its liabilities. And the insurance companies own tremendous amounts of the United States debt. All those things would suffer tremendously.
And so if we did kind of strategically try to sell or lease or somehow put into holding government assets, I mean, it just seems like it would diminish the viability of the country to a certain extent, because those holdings would never be in the government control, right?
Well, yes, but we don't want those government to have so much liability, because they're likely to default on it. So we want the government to get rid of those liabilities and have the liabilities owned by corporations and individuals. And those are people who are in a position to create wealth. And those that create wealth manage over time to diminish their liability. Governments never do that, almost never.
Right. They all increase. All the governments of the world always take on more and more debt. It's a constant story of most. Maybe Germany's the one exception or something like that, but they really are addicted to overspending.
It certainly is. And they're over addicted to too big a governments all over the world.
Right. And that's one point of your book on the solution of how to stay out of debt is addressing the problems with our government.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Yes. I think that the government should be tremendously reduced. The most important thing is to limit the U.S. House and Senate members to 1 term each. 2 years for the House, 6 years for the Senate. Hopefully we'd get a constitutional amendment to reduce the Senate from 6 years to 4 years. We want people to come in and to serve with very low pay because it's their term to serve, and then just get out.
Right. That would be actual service, right? Like actual, not just living off like a tick on the governmental body forever. Like I think my senator has been in there for like 30 or 40 years. She's a geriatric Feinstein, and she doesn't have a lot to talk about it. I mean, there's just give it to. It's interesting because. Yeah, it's just crazy. Some of these, there's no term limits on there, and they're all I think the American people, 75% want term limits, but it just never happens because nobody in DC wants it.
And here's the key: when a constituent calls his representative and says, "I want you to do such and such and such for me, and if you don't do it, I'm going to vote you out of office," the person who's in office can say, "Well, that's okay because I'm going to be leaving anyway."
Right. That's a good point.
Which means that the members of Congress are be less influenced by the desires of the electorate.
Right. Well, that's also an interesting point because if you shorten the terms too, a lot of these guys spend most of their time raising money for the next campaign. Exactly. They're not even doing the work of the government. It's totally corrupt. All the incentives are mixed up.
Yes.
Oh, man. I mean, that's just one small part of your solution too, is that because there's a whole host of other problems. That's probably why we have so much debt. Like you talk about government bureaucracy, you talk about a lot of that stuff. Can you talk about the incentives of the bureaucracy? The
government bureaucrats, first of all, they can't be fired, which means that they're relatively unaffected by the desires of the people because, that's their problem. We're in power and we continue to be in power. And we don't really care that much whether they suffer or not. And also, they don't want to be blamed. And thirdly, they want pay. They want a good pay, and they are paid well. They're paid about 70%, including benefits. They're paid about 70% more than people with equivalent jobs in the private sector.
Right. I mean, it's incredible. It's really a gravy train because they also have very, their packages on retirement are incredible.
Oh, wonderful.
So much for Congress too, actually.
Yes.
If you serve one term in Congress, you get 90% of your pay for the rest of your life.
Oh.
It's incredible. I mean, they write the laws for themselves. It's super corrupt.
Yeah.
Oh boy. So yeah, the government bureaucrats, I think Trump, one of the first things he did was stalled all government hiring, which was very smart. So they just, through attrition, they just got smaller. And I mean, those guys they don't produce much. I mean, the Department of Education, don't get me started. Like there's a lot of this book. I was just like, amen, amen. It was,
they do produce altogether too much because most of what they produce is harmful.
Well, that's a good point too, right? So you talk about that. You say, there's another one that gets banded around, but it'll never happen. What's up with the Federal Reserve?
The Federal Reserve has done a rotten job trying to control the economy. It's supposed that they think that they can tell whether the economy is has overreached, has become too excited, and that they should reduce it. And then they think that they can tell whether the economy is suppressed too much. Well, the truth is that nobody can tell those things. Certainly the federal can't. The Federal Reserve Bank cannot. The Federal Reserve Bank's effort to control the economy has caused tremendous volatility in the economy, way up and way down. And when it goes down, the people that get hurt the most are the poor.
All right. Yeah, I mean, that's really what it, I mean, isn't it really just there to maintain the social status quo, in my opinion? I mean, it's really just there for the rich. It's rich bankers who own it. It's a privately held corporation, right?
Well, no, it's basically owned by other banks, but it's
Right.
it's owned by the district banks, district Federal Reserve banks, which are, I guess, partly owned by but basically it's a government organization.
Okay. Wow.
And the purpose of government organizations is to retain their power.
Well, I agree with that. No, I agree. I mean, look at all the stuff you go into: quantitative easing, shadow banking, repo loans. Can you discuss kind of the tricks they use?
Well, shadow banking, it was not created by the federal government. It was created by banks. In effect, it means that they're able to borrow large amounts of money at very low rates in order to finance the trade that's coming from Asia to the United States. And it's a very risky form of, I'm not prepared to describe it in 1 minute. It's a very risky form of borrowing, and and when the problems hit the fan, as they say, that those shadow bankings are going to go busted.
Gotcha. So the shadow banking, I mean, isn't the quantitative easing just their way to manipulate markets, to make sure they're up or whatever, to maintain?
Well, they think that they're preventing the economy from failing,
right.
But basically it's not doing that. The Federal Reserve makes so many mistakes. For example, when interest rates go down, they assume that it's because the economy is weak. Well, that sometimes is the case. It certainly was the case in the Great Depression, but it is certainly not the case now. And it is not never has been very seldom the case in Switzerland, for example, which has a very strong economy prevailingly over many years. And so when they see the interest rates go down, they assume that the economy is weak, and they flood the economy with money, even though it's not necessary.
Right.
The Federal Reserve has done a miserable job, and it should be done away with. All of the things that the Federal Reserve does can be done by the private sector and should be done by the private sector. But now the most important thing, or a very important thing that should be done after the government gets rid of its liabilities, is to reduce the government sector. That is all three levels of the government: federal, state, and local. Right now, those constitute about 37% of the GDP.
That's incredible.
It should be 10%, which is what it was in the 1890s.
Yeah, it's just grown. It's just like a big tumor,
Yeah.
It's just grown and all this top-down stuff. Yeah. There's also many redundancies between the federal governments and the states.
Yeah.
It's just like, this doesn't make sense. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of that stuff has to be pared down, and that's probably why we have a huge debt, is there's a lot of things that are getting spent. I mean, another solution to this bankruptcy is like cut the military spending in half. You could save $500 billion, and even that over time, that'd be one thing over time that could take the pressure of the debt from going up.
Well, for 1 year.
Yeah, I mean, you have to lessen it over time.
But the deficit, the defense budget is about $790 billion. So it's under $1 trillion. Well, the current talk right now, they're talking $2 trillion for the infrastructure. That's twice what the Defense Department is spending.
I know, it's just incredible that they're going to go back and try to pass that. I don't even know if that's going to get passed.
I hope not.
I know.
Another thing is to do. There are 2.8 million federal bureaucrats. 2.8 million federal bureaucrats. They are operating under the civil service system, and I think that the entire civil service system should be done away with. And most of those 2 million people should be let go and let them do something positive for the economy for a change instead of negative.
Right. Yeah. I mean, think about how that would flip if they're actually producing into the economy instead of just taking out of the national fest. No, that's really important. Yeah.
We should go back to what people consider to be a terrible system, which is the spoils system that prevailed until 1888. But the spoils system did very little harm, and that is when the president was able to hire whoever he wanted to, whoever helped him to get into power, he could hire those to help him and be on their cabinet. That's called the spoils system, because the people who wanted to get into power could give money to help the president get elected. But they did relatively little harm, and they were not in power for long. As soon as there was a different party came into power, they all got fired. Well, you can't fire the civil service system because they got it rigged.
Right. That's the way it works. And they all rig it once they get in. The same things with a lot of these teaching systems. You can't even fire a teacher. There's all kinds of stuff. It's just better to put them in a back room and pay them, have them do nothing than fire them. It's really incredible. It's actually unbelievable that they get away with that.
Well, they get away with it because in many cases it's unions. And I think that the unions existed today only because of federal law. Yeah. And I think those laws should be repealed so that unions, we could allow employees to form unions, but it should not be supported by the federal government.
Federal government, right. And you kind of have that mentality, that idea of a lot more competition in a lot of these places would save us money, especially think about one of the healthcare expenditures as well. The lacking competition in healthcare is driving prices up. And a lot of those, there's a lot of payments that go out for people over 65, Medicare, Medi-Cal.
Yes, exactly.
Don't you think? Yeah.
Yes, the healthcare system is twice as expensive. It's twice as expensive as it should be. And it would become less expensive if people had to pay the first, say, $2,500 or $3,000 of their medical costs each year. They had to pay that individually. By doing that, they would become aware of what the costs are, of what the prices are. And they would, when somebody comes in, like, for example, I fell recently, not a year ago, and had a bad gash on my arm, I think it was. Well, I took a cab and they brought me to the hospital, and I was in the emergency room for almost a day. The cost was $2,000. Oh, yeah. If I had instead said, take me to a clinic, they would have fixed up my arm for maybe $150. Tremendous savings.
You got off cheap, actually. 2000. I've heard of much worse bills showing up at people, and that's a whole nother thing. Trump tried to have transparency in the billing process too with these hospitals. Yes. I don't know if that ever happened. I mean, that
it's not happening now, I'm sure.
You have to laugh or you cry. It's so corrupt, and it's just people have gotten used to these means that are really overly expensive. I think probably a lot of those expenditures on their corruption. I know for a fact that one of the stimulus bills under Obama, some of those guys didn't do that work. Like, I was in California, that TARP money just disappeared. Like, there's no real oversight over where that money's going either. There's no auditing as far as I know. No. Which is really scary, which should really terrify people, where that money goes from these huge expenditures. And
I don't think the liberals care what happens to it. I think all they want is power, and they feel they can gain power by giving out money, and then people will therefore vote for them. Another way that the government sector should be reduced to 10% is that all schools, right from kindergarten to universities, should be owned privately, and none of them should be financed by the government.
There's been that kind of movement. I don't think it had a lot of success, but yeah, I mean, it's a good idea. It'd probably save money too.
Oh my goodness, and it would improve the quality of education, and especially improve the quality of university education. This is where all these cockamamie liberal ideas are generated, within the universities.
Right. Right. You say stop funding universities too.
Yes. Oh yes. Very important.
You want to talk about a corrupt system there? Look at the student loan issues and all the stuff, how they make money,
Absolutely.
where that money goes. Some of those people are making incredible amounts of money, scamming young and naive kids into getting loans. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, there's so many problems. I mean, a lot of money could be saved, but the whole system has to be reformed or readapted. I mean, the other thing is, who cares? I mean, right now, the votes don't even matter. You've got black box voting and a government that can't validate their own victory of 2020.
That's right. Well, I think that issue is going to be resolved. I think there's going to be forensic audits in quite a number of states, and I think that the election of 2020 will be reversed. And I expect that within about 12 months, before the 2022 election, that Biden will be removed from the White House and Trump will be reinstated.
Well, he won. I mean, I think they have to audit all 50 states, because I live in California and nobody here likes the people here. I think you mentioned Patrick Byrne in your book, but I think he mentioned that like the actual differentiation between the two parties isn't 50-50. It's really closer to 65-35. That all what you call liberals, what I call the left, the authoritarian left. I don't think they're liberal anymore. Actual classical definition of liberalism, the left is definitely not. So that's
you're correct. Correct.
But yeah, no, it's a real problem. It really just surfaced in 2020. It was so egregious. It's probably been going on for decades.
It's been going on for 105 years, ever since Teddy Roosevelt. 115 years.
Well, I was just reading about when Kennedy won. He just had to take 2 states, West Virginia and Illinois. And so they focused on West Virginia and Illinois. And so the left, this time, they just needed those 6 swing states. So they focused on the urban areas there, and that was it.
That's right.
So, yeah, it's really grotesque, too. And I think you also mentioned how many of these very wealthy people paid to influence the election as well.
Yes. It is weird that the people who are wealthy seem to report that they seem to want the left to be in power, and it's weird. Stupid. It's stupid of them to want to do that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very odd.
But I think that the left has gone so far to the left and so far out of the mainstream of American thought that I think that the people are going to be willing to accept the kinds of ideas that I suggest. Namely,
I would agree with that, yeah. No, you're right. They're really extreme. The real predominant power of the left is like crypto neo-Marxism. I mean, It's really, and all their ideas, the critical race theory is just fantasyland intellectualism. It just has no basis in reality, but that's part of the psychological power of it. That's why they're ramming it down people's throats. They want to mind rape them. That's really what critical race theory is.
Absolutely.
Oh, man. So you go into a lot of that. You talk about the breach of the Capitol. So a lot of these things are very pertinent, I think, for the overall view of the country, that like the left doesn't not acknowledge that the reason why the Capitol people were angry on July 6th is what happened on November 3rd, right?
Exactly.
So
but I think January 6th was partly caused by the government, because when Obama was in for 8 years, he put in his people into the top echelons of the most important agencies, namely the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and the Justice Department. And those people they're now basically run by liberals. And I think that I understand that the FBI was part of the people that went into the Capitol on January 6th.
Right. Well, they get caught instigating all kinds of stuff right now. The whole thing about Whitmer in Michigan was instigated by the FBI, and the other guys were probably hapless, didn't know what was going on.
Yes.
So it wouldn't surprise me at all if what happened January 6th was actually an operation. I think you mentioned in your book that like Trump's speech ended only like 10 minutes after that.
No.
10 minutes, then yeah.
No, but about 45 minutes. It ended 45 minutes before the people entered. They entered the Capitol. It was already sorry.
It was
it's
like
the reverse. Yeah,
right.
it was reverse. The entrance to the Capitol began 45 minutes before the end of the Trump speech.
Right. So, and then you have a chapter on, I think you cover maybe some of the stuff in your earlier book that you published last year about how governments hurt the poor. Can you kind of cover that before we wrap this up? Can you go into that?
Yes. There are so many ways that government primarily hurts the poor. One is, the most important is the fact that the government controls the economy and does a wretched job of it, causing big downturns which hurt the poor terribly. Another one that I is quite unique. I don't remember reading this anywhere else. It begins with the understanding of the automobile market. New automobiles are overpriced. Used automobiles are underpriced. So when automobiles move down the income scale, a tremendous amount of value transfers from the wealthy to the poor. The very same thing, in fact, even more so, would happen in real estate if government got out of the real estate markets. Real estate, the government is not involved with the automobile markets, which is why this occurs. But in real estate, oh my God, the government is involved with tax policies, employment, environment, all kinds of ways that the government interferes with the sales of real estate. If they just stopped all of that, this enormous privately owned, never organized by anyone, it's just natural, would take place in the real estate market, where people would spend a lot of money to build houses, and then as they vacate and move into another house, that house, it becomes owned by somebody who's less wealthy and less wealthy and less wealthy, and eventually it gets to the bottom. But all of that increases the wealth of the poor. Thirdly, healthcare, we've already described. If healthcare were made competitive, the cost of real estate, the cost of healthcare would go down by about half. Obesity. In 1973, the government passed, I got to get a drink of water. In 1973, the government passed a law for the first time that paid money to the people who grew corn and other staple commodities like that. Never did they have any thought that that 50 years later, that they would be responsible for the tremendous increase in obesity, because corn is involved, and high fructose corn syrup is involved with so many of the products, the foods that we buy, especially the prepared foods, and it's caused, I think has caused the obesity.
I think so too. I've actually heard that the monies that are given to underprivileged people are typically spent at like dollar food services at McDonald's and things like that are full of additives. You don't even know what's in there, and a lot of those kids end up unhealthy. So it's really kind of a shame.
I agree. Thirdly, this is number 6, welfare. Tom Sowell said, I love that man, Tom Sowell, Black families survived centuries of slavery and a generation of Jim Crow, but Black families disintegrated because of the expansion of the welfare state. When the welfare is paid, they don't pay to couples, they pay to the mother, and the more children she has, the more she gets paid. So she throws the first fight that they have. She throws him out, and she gets another man, and she has another baby, and she gets more money. And the result is that so many black children are raised in single-family homes, and single-family homes are the ways that time after time it causes academic failure and crime behavior and economic hardship.
Yeah, a lot. And it was ostensibly given to people well-meaning, right? Oh, here's your handout from the government. So you see another element of the government ostensibly for your benefit that doesn't actually benefit. It incentivizes divorce, separation, single-parent families, and the concomitant kind of social malaise that happened after that. I mean, there's so many stories. Look at lottery. Honestly, you mentioned lottery in your book. And yesterday I was at the market and I just saw this poor person just drop $10 on lottery tickets here in California. And I just was like, yeah, that doesn't work, baby. That's not the way to go.
It certainly doesn't. And occupational licenses where the poor, they can't get work in the salons because the occupational people who are in occupations, they are licensed. And the purpose of the license is to restrict the number of workers in those industries so that the worker prices go up, the wages go up. Well, this means that the poor people cannot get those jobs because they're limited by the occupational licensing. But the products that those occupationals produce are higher priced because of the licenses, and so that the poor get hurt twice. They can't get the jobs in those salons, and they have to pay higher prices when they use them.
Right. Yeah, no, it's unbelievable. And then, like, here's this whole thing. Biden is supposedly the man of the poor, but he's let in a million illegal immigrants. And who does that hurt? That dilutes the labor market and drives all those labor prices down. So all the rich people benefit off of cheap labor, right?
Yes, but that's not the that's not the primary purpose of that immigration policy. The primary purpose is to allow people who are very likely to vote Democrat to get into the United States where they can vote Democrats.
Supposedly.
That's the primary purpose.
So, Archie, we are at 37 minutes right now. When is this? Can you remind me when the book will be published, and where's the best place for the listener to obtain the book?
Probably on Amazon Books. I don't know whether it's on Amazon yet, but it shortly will be. And thereafter, you could buy it in bookstores. I
think it's actually place held there on Amazon. Are you going to do a Kindle regular version? Do you have an audiobook planned, do you know?
I have not. My publisher hasn't said anything about that. I'm happy to do that, but...
you might read. I've heard that right now, like some of these book purchases are 50-50. There's a lot of audiobooks being purchased.
Great. Well. Love to do it.
Is that a piano there behind you on the right?
Yes, it is.
Would you mind playing a little piece before we wrap this up?
Oh, no, I don't practice anymore.
You don't practice at all? You don't even play it?
No, I don't. When after the lockdowns and I couldn't perform, I didn't want to practice, especially because my hands are 85 years old. Gotcha. And you can't play Chopin, Rachmaninoff, and Liszt without doing ardent exercises every day, Gotcha. Finger exercises, and those exercises were beginning to hurt my hands.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
So they don't hurt now because I'm not doing them, but so I don't play anymore.
Okay, well, I wish it would be a nice kind of send off, but anyway, again, the title of the book is America's Bankruptcy Approaches: How to Resolve the Issue and Prevent It from Reoccurring by Archie Richards. Archie, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Bill.
All right, take care. I'm just going to shut this down. Just stay on the line. Okay, so that broadcast